Hi, I'm going to show you how I batched out 8 solid wood trays, mostly over the course of a weekend. I decided not to use plywood for these as I don't love the way 1/4-inch hardwood plywood looks on the bad side on the bottoms. During the build there were a few firsts for me, first time resawing my new bandsaw, and first time making a larger batch of a product, as well as the first time making a serving tray. Watch along as I get to see what we can get done in a weekend. Next up, we cut to length for the sides, ends, and bottoms. I bought 4/4 cherry and 4/4 maple for this. The first one I made as a sample. I tried to keep the bottom 3/4 of an inch thick, but it ended up being way too heavy of a tray and I think kind of overkill. So I decided it was best to resaw these. I cut them as close to in half as I could with a target final thickness of about 3/8 of an inch. Next up here, we just run the bottoms through the planer. Really want to just remove the bandsaw marks and get them to that final thickness of about 3/8 of an inch. So since I got a fence installed on my router table, I think this has become my favorite way to joint an edge, especially on these smaller, thinner pieces. I find it easiest to use a template bit so you can flush up with the bearing. I had to run these through a few times, usually 3 times to get them straight on that one edge. The real key to this technique is to make sure you're applying pressure on the outfeed side of the bit. If you apply pressure on the infeed side, you'll end up with a bow instead of a flat edge. Ask me how I know. I really need to cut another slot in this table for a featherboard, but that's a project for another day. I've been getting better at getting organized with my glue ups, but I have to say this one was pretty stressful. Not enough clamps, not enough space, and just too many pieces to glue up. Overall, it came out okay, but yeah, wasn't a great time. I let them dry in the clamps for a few hours before popping them out. They seemed pretty solid, but I was pretty gentle with them until I was sure that they had cured up nice and tight. Then just hit them with a scraper to get all the squeeze out off and run over the edges and the joints real quickly with some 120 grit sandpaper. Another pass through the router table here to joint up one edge to allow it to be super flat to run against the fence on the table saw so I can cut these down to final width. Then I just set the fence to the width that I wanted for these bottoms and ripped the other side off so they were nice and straight. I used my crosscut sled to square up both edges here. Once I had both edges straight and square, I set up a long level as a stop block to cut these down to the appropriate length. Now back to the planer to get the sides and ends down to their final thickness. These boards are all flat, so there's no need to joint their faces. Working with shorter material, I find it's often flat enough to work with straight from the store. Sometimes it needs a bit of a help, but not this time. I was able to get these down to 3/4 of an inch after a few passes. I need a proper dust collector, but for now my Festool dust extractor does okay. I had to empty the cyclone about 8 times during this build. And again, to straighten an edge for these guys on the router table. I found with all the pieces for these 8 trays, it was really helpful to pause and reorganize myself a few times throughout the build. Make sure I have every piece accounted for and nothing got mixed out of order. Here I just set the fence to 2 3/4 of an inch for the final height of the sides and ends. I ran all the pieces through the table saw to get to the final height. I first cut one miter on each piece. It was here, after futzing around to get the right length for each piece for probably 30 minutes, that I remembered I needed to cut the dados in each piece first. Ugh. I do have to say though, my brother bought me this tiny little square for Christmas. I wasn't sure that I was going to use it for, but it works amazingly well for transferring angles from the faces of these boards to the skinny edges. I used one of the tray bottoms to set the height for the dados. I cut the dados 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom and 3/8 of an inch thick so the bottoms fit tightly. I have to say I love these bow foam feather boards. They hold crazy strong against the fence with not pushing too much pressure to knock the fence out of alignment, and I think there's very little risk of kickback. Obviously, using a SawStop CTS, I can't use a dado stack here, so I was forced to pass them through a number of times and kind of sneak up on the cut for each one. Took a bit of time, but got there in the end. I cut one complete set of miters so I could use them as a reference for the stop blocks going forward for the other pieces. That seemed to work pretty well. I snuck up on the cuts to make sure everything was a nice tight fit, and then clamped the block in place here and just buzzed through the rest of them. I built a little plywood template here to cut out the handles. I used my drill press with a Forstner bit, I think it was 1.25 bit, to hog out most of the material. Then I popped over to the router table and carefully went back and forth to knock the high points off and then to get down to the right thickness across the template for each piece. Took a bit of time and had one nasty surprise with some kickback, but generally it was pretty good and felt pretty safe. Then a quick round over here to soften the handles. I did most of the sanding on all of the pieces before the trays were assembled. I thought this would be easier than dealing with it with the built trays. And now time for the glue up. This went pretty well since I had kind of dry fit everything before and made sure that everything fit nice and snug. I only had 2 band clamps, so I had to do 2 trays at a time. Let them sit for about a half an hour, popped them out of the clamps, and then did 2 more. Again, took a bit of time. I thought about buying more band clamps, but at the end of the day, I haven't really had much of a need for more than 2, so I just went with this. I went through the rest of the sharp edges here with the 1/8 inch roundover bit just to soften them a bit. I know everybody's favorite part of any project, it's sanding time. I hit them with 150 grit as my final sand. I had to do a lot of hand sanding and some work with a chisel here to chip out any of the glue squeeze out. I probably had more than I would have liked to. I think the next time I do something like this, I am going to try putting masking tape in the corners just to keep this to a minimum because it really sucked. I decided to finish these with the satin Osmo Polyx, or Polyx, I'm not quite sure how to say that. Overall, I was impressed with the finish. I wouldn't say I like it quite as much as the Rubio I've used in the past. After putting it on, I read the instructions and it says it needs 3 to 4 coats. I applied it just like Rubio with 1 coat and they seem to be pretty good. I might hit them with another coat just to see if I can get a little bit more shine out of the wood, but overall pretty happy with the way they turned out. Well, there you have it. I had some family things that came up over the course of the weekend, and I wasn't able to get everything done on Saturday and Sunday. That, combined with not having enough clamps and running out of Osmo, it took me a few hours over the course of the next few evenings to get these polished off. I'm sure I could get this done in a weekend now that I know what I'm doing and things are a little bit better organized. Hope you enjoyed the build. Let me know if you have any feedback in the comments.